Hi, I am Nicole Vapp. I am the Director of Investigative Journalism at 9News and Tegna, our parent company. And this is Kevin Vaughn, investigative reporter, and we're talking about our latest story in a series of stories on a man named Bob Feldman. And Kevin, I was just thinking about the first news tip we got about this. We had never heard of him before. We didn't even know about Stacy's death. This was before he was arrested, before they made any charges. And so I thought maybe real quick we could kind of go back and just talk a little bit about she died, and then it was a couple years later before he was arrested, and maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Bob Feldman called 911 on March 1st, 2015. He said he'd come home and he found his wife, Stacy, in the bathtub, unresponsive. And the paramedics came, and Stacy Feldman, despite their efforts to resuscitate her, died there at their home. And initially, Denver's coroner ruled that the cause of death was undetermined. She had some blunt force injuries, but the coroner thought those might have come from the resuscitation efforts, from getting her out of the bathtub. And so the case, sort of stalled for a while. But Denver police were suspicious. They were suspicious of the timeline of events of that day when Bob Feldman told them he had come and gone. They were suspicious enough that they kept investigating. And some months later, they heard from a woman who told them that she had had an affair with Bob Feldman, thought he was divorced, had actually contacted Stacy and confirmed that they were not divorced, and told Stacy about the affair. And the woman said that conversation happened earlier that same day, the day Stacy died. And of course, Denver police kept investigating after that. Eventually, they took the autopsy and photographs and other evidence in the case to an outside doctor. And he looked at it all and concluded that she was murdered, that she was suffocated or strangled, that the injuries she sustained were from being killed by someone else. And so in February of 2018, almost 3 years after her death, Denver police arrested Bob Feldman on suspicion of first-degree murder, and he ultimately was formally charged with that, with first-degree murder in the death of his wife, and he is now, more than 3 years later, still awaiting trial.
And so he got out on bond, right?
That's right. The prosecutors. I'm sorry?
You had to post a pretty high bond.
Yeah, the prosecution had to present their evidence to the judge. The judge ruled that the case was not strong enough to just keep him in jail indefinitely. So he ultimately set bail at $1 million. Bob Feldman was able to work with a bondsman to come up with the money, and that bond got paid in July of 2018. And he was sent home with a GPS ankle monitor and placed basically on, in layman's terms, house arrest.
And so he's been on house arrest since July of 2018, correct?
Yes. Yes.
If people are kind of thinking, I've heard about this guy, I've heard you guys talk about this guy before. We did a story about a year ago exactly on some other things he's been doing since he's been on house arrest. We might want to talk about that real quick to catch people up.
Sure. And we should know on house arrest, the person basically is supposed to be at home, except for very limited allowances to do certain things. We can talk about those more in a minute. But a year ago, we reported that he had been renting out his backyard swimming pool to people, unsuspecting people that didn't know, that he was accused of first-degree murder. He was appearing on dating websites, sometimes with different names, different ages. You see on one of those there, he said he was 46 years old. And he was doing this despite the fact that, he was basically supposed to be living a very restricted life at home. The city of Denver said he didn't have a license to be renting out the swimming pool, so they put a stop to that. But the appearance on the dating apps and so forth, we continue to hear that that's going on. We heard from a couple of women that he'd actually gone out on dates with in that story last year, one of whom went out on a date with him after Stacy Feldman died, but before he was arrested. And the other woman had gone out on a date with him after he'd been arrested, met with him at a park. And so those are the stories we've kind of done about him and some of his activities while he's been on house arrest and charged with first-degree murder and the death of his wife, Stacy.
And I remember we put out those dating websites, JDate and some other sites that he had profiles on. And then we got another tip that you should take a look at this other app. And you want to talk about that app and kind of what we saw there?
Yeah, the app is called Strava, and it's an exercise app. I have a very similar app on my phone. If I go for a bike ride or a walk or a hike or even a run, sometimes I'll turn on the app and it records how far I go and how quickly I go and how many calories I burn and all that sort of stuff. And Strava has a function where you can post your exercise on a website. And we discovered this website profile on the Strava website for a man named Bob Feldman living in Inglewood. Now, Robert Feldman lives in Denver, but it had him living in Inglewood. And we started looking at it, and all of the rides were starting. I shouldn't say all the rides. Almost all the rides were starting right at his house. He was taking bike rides and a few walks, and they started at his house, and they went all over the metro area. What we really didn't know when we first started looking at this is what his restrictions were. And so we knew he was supposed to basically be at home, but it turned out he was allowed to leave to visit his, go to a doctor's appointment, visit with his lawyer, meet with his lawyer, go to court dates, of course. And he was allowed to go out once a week to get groceries. In 2019, after the death of his grandmother, he was given an exception to be able to go to a synagogue every day for a year and pray for her in the wake of her death. And he also was at one point given an allowance to leave the house 3 times a day to take a walk for 15 minutes each. And then later that was expanded to 3 one-hour walks a day. But we were looking at all these bike rides on Strava where it maps where he goes. And we saw that he was stopping at coffee shops. We saw that he was stopping at restaurants. We saw that, that there were some trips to his lawyer's office. There certainly were some trips to medical clinics. But we saw other rides. We saw a ride out to Morrison last year where he was gone, 5 hours or so from home. And so we started asking, is this something he should be doing? And it turned out that Denver Pretrial Services, which monitors people like Bob Feldman on house arrest, had been looking at his GPS ankle monitor, and they had concluded that he was going places he wasn't supposed to go, that he was getting far away from his home, and that he was going to restaurants and stuff. What they didn't know until we told them is that he was doing it with these bicycle rides. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves when we were looking at this was, are we certain this is the same Bob Feldman? And we were able to confirm that it was a variety of ways. I'm sorry, Nicole, what was that?
It took some time to figure out, that it was him, but we kept going back to that address, and we tried to watch to see if he was leaving on a bike.
Yeah, and at one point, we shot some video of him leaving on a bike and riding back home that same day, and we did that again on another occasion. And so we had the video, and we knew exactly the day and times we shot those videos. And so we compared that to the rides that were on the Strava app, and it confirmed for us that we had the right Strava profile, that this was our person. And then the filing that did, so Denver Pretrial Services went to court actually and filed a summons against Mr. Feldman and asked that he be, ordered to stop going away from his house when he was for things he wasn't supposed to leave for. He is allowed to ride his bike if he's going to one of those things he's allowed to do, like going to a doctor's office. If he wants to ride his bike there, that's okay. But like I said, lots of these rides on Strava didn't go to a doctor's office or a lawyer's office or to a grocery store. And those are the ones that we really focused in on.
Let's go through like a few of these rides, and we kind of picked some for this that are key rides. So the first one that we see recorded was just a few months after he got out on bond, right? And what is it, October of
Yeah, early
2018?
October 2018. Yep, early October 2018. The first ride that appeared on Strava after his release. And I should say, there are rides on Strava from before his arrest. And then there's a long period of inactivity, of course, when he was in jail for a few months. And then in October, so, 3 months after, 2 months after he got released on bond, there was a ride that left his house and went to downtown Denver. And you can actually see that he went up and down the 16th Street Mall and returned back home. He's gone for several hours. He lives in Southeast Denver. And so, we just started looking at these, and the app records, like if you can see this scene here, the app records not only how far he went, but his moving time. So for an hour and 5 minutes, he was actually riding his bike. But if you look down a little bit farther, you see the elapsed time, an hour and 56 minutes. So we know somewhere on this ride, he was idle for 51 minutes, was not moving. And in some cases, it's easy to see what he was doing. There's one of these where when you zoom in on it at a Starbucks, you can see that he was moving all around there while he was not riding his bike. There are rides like this one that start a long way from his home. So, we don't know how he and his bike got there, but,
He's Ken Carroll.
Yeah, that's Ken Carroll. It's like a Jefferson, mountain park up there. And again, here you see 41 minutes of non-riding, non-moving time in this ride, which, in which, he covered 8 miles up there in the foothills.
Mm-hmm. So another key time was last September, and that you mentioned earlier was the trip to Morrison. Now, there's no medical clinic there. His law offices aren't there. So what did you see when you looked at that one?
So we saw the ride started at his house in Southeast Denver, and it went sort of northwest from there, and he stopped at a house where he frequently stops. We believe it's at the home of a friend of his. And he was there for a short time, it looks like. And then he started riding west, and he rode all the way to Morrison. And the ride ends in front of a pizza restaurant. This happened on a Sunday. And so he was at this, the ride ended in front of this pizza restaurant. And for 51 minutes, the app did not record any activity. So presumably he shut it off. And then the ride picks back up in front of that pizza shop, and he rode all the way back home to his house in Southwest Denver. And that was one of the days that we had been out trying to see if he was riding his bike, and we shot footage of him in a couple of different places on this ride, including right after he left his house and was getting out of his neighborhood there. And he was gone almost 5 hours on this day. There aren't stops at medical clinics or courthouses or anything like that he's allowed to do. And so this was one of the rides that we looked at and that fit into that pattern that Denver Pretrial Services alleged that he was engaging in, which was going far away from his house, going to places he wasn't supposed to go, and being gone for much longer than he was supposed to be gone.
Yeah, and so I want to remind people they can ask us some questions in the Facebook comments, and we'll try to answer any questions that you have about any of this case. But one thing, Kevin, I was talking to someone earlier today, and they were asking me some questions about this, and asked how we were able to figure out what he was supposed to be doing or what he wasn't supposed to be doing. And that was difficult in this case. And, I don't want to give away too many of your secrets, but you really had to pound that. Like, we've been working on trying to figure that out for months and months, because it's not something you just go look up.
Right. The pretrial services has sort of a standard language that it has for everybody that's in this category that Mr. Feldman is in, known as maximum supervision, which is only allowed to leave the home for very limited reasons. So, we went to the court, we went through the entire court record. And because this case has been going on for, more than 3 years now, it's voluminous, as you can imagine. And we'd actually been in court for some of his efforts to get more freedom. Like after the death of his grandmother, he actually went to court and got a ruling from the judge that said he could go to his synagogue every day to pray. And there was an effort by the district attorney's office in court to take away that privilege after a year and to allow him to only go to church, to religious services once a week. But in terms of the bedrock rules, when we began asking for them from the court, they directed us to pretrial services, and pretrial services directed us back to the court. And it was sort of a catch-22. But eventually, we made a request for complaints against anybody under maximum supervision. And they provided us with a complaint that they filed against Mr. Feldman, and it spelled out his allowances to be able to leave his house. And then they had a court hearing, and we got the transcript of that court hearing, and the pretrial services supervisor detailed when he was allowed to leave and for what. And so at that point, we knew the stuff we're seeing on the Strava app does not line up in every case with what he's allowed to be doing.
So when you were talking to pretrial services, I know that they can't talk about specific people who still haven't been to trial, and Bob hasn't been to trial yet. But did you get the sense that they're able to follow all these folks that are on this high supervision, and B, do they?
They told us that they have the ability to monitor these GPS tracking devices 24/7. So they definitely have the ability. The technology is there. The question that we don't have an answer to at this point is how often were they monitoring Bob Feldman? And the reason I say we don't have an answer to it is because, first of all, they told us they would not answer questions about any specific person that they're tracking who has not, as you said, not yet gone to trial. And Bob Feldman has not gone to trial. So, how often were they looking? Well, it's an open question in my mind because of this. He started riding his bike in October 2018. We can see lots of rides from then until last fall that raise questions about whether he was doing something that was approved by pretrial services. But it wasn't until last fall that pretrial services actually went to court and said he's breaking the rules. And so for 2 years, he was out riding his bike. I mean, hundreds of days he was out riding, and many days he rode more than once. And, it was 2 years before anybody raised a question from pretrial services. So I don't know the extent to which they were monitoring him actively as opposed to looking back at what he'd been doing when they got a complaint. And they did acknowledge they've gotten a number of complaints from neighbors that have seen him out and about and wondering why he's allowed to do that on pretrial services, on house arrest.
So let's go back to that September. So when they got that complaint, does Bob Feldman find out about that and his lawyers find out about that right away?
Yes. I mean, I don't know when they were served, but that complaint included a court date in December, which ended up not happening. It got delayed. So many things in the courts have been delayed in the past year because of COVID. But that was delayed for several more months. But yes, he would have gotten a copy of that summons. It would have been served to him or his attorneys, and it directed him to appear in court to answer questions about this, or at least for his attorney to answer questions about this. So the hearing based on that complaint didn't actually happen until just a few weeks ago.
So they would have found out because they at least knew by December, but they knew before that because they had to set this court date that
Right.
were looking into Morrison ride, that it was a bike ride, that it was a Morrison ride, and then uh, so they knew that he was being questioned. He knew he was being questioned. Yet there are other rides since then.
There are other rides since then. I will say this: his most active year of bike riding was 2019. He curtailed it in 2020. I mean, in 2019, I think he rode. I could look, but he did many more days of riding and many more miles in 2019 than he has done in the years since then. So he cut back some in 2020, and I would say that he cut back further after he got this notice, which was dated October 15th. But there were still rides, and there was a ride yesterday that went downtown Denver. Now it looks like he went to his attorney's office. We weren't there, so we don't know, but it goes down to that area, and so um, the thing that's interesting about this is, and this is a little bit nuanced. Pretrial services did not know he was riding his bike. They knew where he was going based on the ankle monitor that he's wearing that is connected to GPS and sending a signal all the time. And for their purposes, they don't really care if it's a bike or a light rail train or he's walking or he's in a car. If he's going where he's supposed to be going, and so they raised the objections, not that he was riding his bike, but that he was going to places he shouldn't be going. He was going very far from his home, Morrison, Golden, Broomfield, and that he was gone from his home for much longer than he was allowed to be gone.
Interesting. So that he has done some rides since then. Will anyone take a look at those rides? Did they say they're going to look at those rides?
We confirmed with pretrial services yesterday that because of the questions we've raised about this, that they're going to be looking much more closely at his movements. What that'll look like, we won't know. I mean, we're not privy to what their GPS. They did an audit of the GPS, which gave them a complete look at everywhere he'd been. We're not allowed to see that. We see what is recorded on this app, which is, basically when he's on his bicycle or he's walking or running. And there were, hundreds of bike rides. There were a few dozen walks and a handful of runs recorded on there since he's been on house arrest.
Well, I know that we'll keep tabs on what's happening and any developments in the case. Anything else that you can think of that we learned during this process?
Well, so at the hearing a few weeks ago, the judge basically said, if you want exercise, you can have unlimited use of your own backyard. And other than that, he now is supposed to be allowed to go to a doctor's appointment, to a meeting with his lawyer, to court, and to the grocery store once a week. And he can go to one religious service a week. And he was given a choice of either Friday night or Saturday morning services at the synagogue of his choice. And other than that, he is not supposed to leave his home.
All right. Well, that's good for people to know. We'll keep checking in on this. I think I don't have any questions. Does anybody else have any questions? I haven't seen any pop up. So, but if you have any information about this or any other case involving someone who's on an ankle monitor and maybe not doing what they're supposed to be doing, please let us know. We'd love to keep following up because it's obvious that some of these folks are being watched more than others. And so we just want to check in and see when they're not. Anything else, Kevin?
No, I mean, they can email blow the whistle at 9news.com. Blow the whistle at 9news.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys. Thanks for
Thank you.
watching.
Bye.
Bye.